For now, the United States is the uncontested global hegemon. There are other states which are powerful in certain aspects or dominate their own areas of the world. No nation has as much of a global power projection as the US. No ocean is without American bases, and no nation on Earth can ignore the US as a military or economic power. Their army budget is larger than the rest of the top 10 combined. But the hegemon is not invulnerable. The Chinese have massively grown their economy the past decades, and they are, in recent years, increasingly stepping up their investment into the military as well, threatening the US position in the Pacific. Everyone knows about the way in which the Russians are currently attempting to stand up to the US hegemony, and even the EU, following the end of the Cold War and American interventions in the Middle East, have increasingly started to question the US foreign policy. But this leads us to the question, just how strong is the US currently? And can the US survive if somehow the entire rest of the world coordinated an attack on the nation? Now usually I have a section here where I attempt to create a logical explanation as to how this may occur, but obviously this would never happen. The idea that the US would go to war with the other global powers isn't too crazy to think about, but all of their enemies and allies suddenly deciding to declare war is ludicrous. But these allies do raise an important question. What happens to US military bases outside of the US itself? If war is declared out of nowhere, the US would likely lose a lot of military assets in the first week of conflict. To keep things somewhat fair for the US, thanks to either diplomatic channels or intelligence efforts, the US knows this war is coming, allowing the Americans to retreat from at least some of their bases and consolidate in the Americas and Pacific. For the sake of this scenario, we will also assume that nations on Earth are fully committed to this war. However bad the war gets, no nation will sign a separate peace deal with the Americans. Another very important thing to mention here are nuclear weapons, and we will obviously remove them from this scenario. The US by themselves have the capability to end the world 3 times over, with nations like Russia capable of returning the favor as well. Consider nuclear weapons as non-existent for the sake of this scenario. What's interesting about this concept, in my opinion, is twofold. It allows us to take a military look at the current world in a fun way by exploring just how long America can hold out. Because, let's be honest, the US is not winning this long-term conflict. And secondly, although this video will focus on the military aspect, it also allows us to take a look at a world where the US, as the diplomatic and economic center of the world, is suddenly and violently removed. So let's begin with the initial war efforts. To start off with, despite the entire world declaring war on the US, it's the US who takes the initiative and the offensive. Many bases were abandoned, but others may very well have been reinforced. Greenland, for example, could be easily captured, as well as many key bases across the Pacific. The US is also the world's largest military and naval power, with no individual nation being able to stand up to them. The US would begin the war controlling many of the world's key oceans, with existing US bases being reinforced and small Pacific islands being swiftly captured. From here, the US would need to quickly secure their own backyard, where they face little threat. Canada has no hope of standing up to the US, and without naval supremacy, the rest of the world can do little to assist it. Central America, similarly, is little threat to the US. Still though, don't expect a full US occupation of the entire region. Mexico by itself has 120 million people, which would be a very costly occupation. Instead, priorities would be set, with important naval and air bases as well as resource-rich regions being secured, and military and infrastructure targets in territories that won't be captured being raided or destroyed, paralyzing the rest of the already weak Central American militaries. Central America would always continue to be a burden, especially in terms of guerrilla war, but militarily speaking, there isn't a direct threat from the region to the US. And as such, at the start of the war, the US is pretty safe. US control over the oceans will prevent the other powers from reinforcing the American theater, but even if we assume that the US naval supremacy starts to break down, good luck to China, Russia and Europe landing and supplying forces in Central America with the infrastructure destroyed. But it's not just in the Americas where the US holds the initiative. One of the most important early fronts would be in the Persian Gulf. The US cannot hope to win the long-term conflict over these seas, but a significant amount of the world's oil travels through this Gulf to China and Europe. Even by just temporarily stopping transport through the Gulf, as well as sabotaging the Suez Canal, Europe and China would see their industries heavily suffer. Even if, after just a couple of months, the US decides that it's too dangerous to continue to operate in the Persian Gulf, these months would devastate any early action that Europe or China would want to take, crippling the US' two main rivals at the start of this war. With choke points like the Panama, Suez, Persian Gulf and the Malacca Strait at least temporarily blocked by the US submarine or surface fleets, the world's trade would grind to a halt. Meanwhile, days after the war is declared, the entire world would start to experience an economic crash many times worse than the Great Recession, as the entire financial system of the world is suddenly uprooted. Interconnectivity is key across the world, and any major power suddenly pulling out would be a massive deal. But right now, the US is still the single most important economy. Inflation would spike everywhere, savings are destroyed, exports and imports are disrupted, Mexico and China being hit hardest by the direct lack of American trade, while the luxury service-based economies in the West would be hit extremely hard as well. Since service economies are a luxury which are poorly suited for total war. To add on this already existing economic collapse, there is the previously mentioned lack of oil, as the US temporarily disrupts the Persian Gulf shipping. Europe and China would suddenly have to massively ration any oil they do have for military forces and essential production, restricting the public and commercial sectors from their most vital energy source. Without oil and with the current economic collapse, most commercial, luxury and non-essential companies would fall, downscale or have to switch to wartime production. Now obviously, the US is struck by similar issues. Their service economy is destroyed. Their massive resource and good exports and imports are wiped out. Their economy is now in the gutter, and their global supply routes are disrupted, since even though they control the oceans, there is literally no one left to trade with. But the big difference here is that the US is one actor, making it much easier to find and regulate the needs of the US and its military after the major initial economic shocks. While the coalition of the rest of the world needs to manage not only more people, but also has more competing governments with different ideas and needs as to how to conduct the war and solve the economic issues. Since despite being united in war with America, the idea that these nations would somehow work together well is laughable. Meanwhile, the US has the initiative in the war and massive, secure resource deposits in North and Central America. The US right now exports more oil than they import, and they have the option to ramp up oil drilling even more if they have to. During the early stages of the war, the US can even do some more daring maneuvers, capturing certain resource deposits in Latin America if the need arises. Obviously, the US would still be struck extremely hard, and much like the rest of the world, civilian consumption would take a nosedive. But the US does have an easier time consolidating and recovering than the rest of the world. This economic collapse would also mean unrest spreading across the world. The US would be under attack, meaning that most Americans would accept the necessity of the economic downturn, while nations like Russia and China, with their autocratic governments and ideological reasons to fight the US, would to some extent be able to shrug off the unrest, but nations which used to be close allies to the US would mostly see their population devastated and confused by the whole war, with especially the democracies questioning why this war is even necessary. Landlocked nations, Africa and Southeast Asia also have little way of meaningfully impacting the war, yet they are still dragged into the ramifications of it. The other nations in the Americas would also be vocally opposed to this war, since even when combining all of their strength, they have no hope to stand up to the US. The American nations are just waiting and hoping that other nations can finally break the American naval supremacy and start supplying, rebuilding and defending the American nations. This war would also bring an enormous humanitarian disaster. Food trade across the world would be devastated, and especially food insecure nations would see famines occur, with especially the poorer and more remote regions left to famine, with especially South America in an extremely weak situation, as with the early US naval supremacy, Southern America would essentially be isolated from global trade. So, with the initial stages of the war now mapped out, what would the response from the rest of the world be? Well, initially, as the Middle Eastern supply is disrupted, Russia and select other states start to increase their oil production to replace the disrupted Gulf trade. New routes over secure seas and land are developed or increased to transport goods without fear of American interception. In terms of a military response, the coalition would start off slow and careful, as apart from the European section of NATO, there is little international military cooperation and any solo maneuver would be dangerous. Not to mention that communication would become more difficult as the US has the initial advantage in the space war, with most satellites being US backed or owned and the US being further ahead in anti-satellite warfare. Both sides would restrict the others' access to their satellites while trying to destroy their opponents, practically destroying the internet for most of the world. With all of this established, the US doesn't seem to be in too bad of a spot. Despite the entire world declaring war on them, they are on the offensive. But the rest of the world has one major advantage over the US: time. Yes, the US Navy is extremely impressive and dominant in the early stage of the war, but let's not kid ourselves. The US cannot keep this global pressure up forever. While having the initiative, the US is still plagued by lack of resources, harassment campaigns from Latin America, submarine harassment of supply lines, and more. While the US does have the significant advantage initially, it cannot hope to sustain a war across the world forever. As the rest of the world slowly starts to increase cooperation between their war economies and militaries, they become increasingly able to coordinate strikes against the US. The exact timeline is impossible to predict, so feel free to fill in your own opinion as to how long each section of the war takes, but what is clear is that this war will take years, and few of the objectives I will sketch here are easy to accomplish. So, to start off, before the World Coalition can even consider going after the US mainland, the US stranglehold over the world's oceans needs to be addressed. While the dangers of Atlantic shipping is unfortunate for Europe and disastrous for Latin America, for now, the Atlantic isn't a major objective. What the world really needs is to free up their most vital waters, the Persian Gulf and the larger Mediterranean to Chinese shipping lanes. But this is easier said than done. With the Suez sabotaged, the European and Russian navies have no way to reach the Indian Ocean. Instead, China, Europe, India and Russia would work to secure the coastlines around the Persian Gulfs, building up air bases, air defenses and anti-ship systems around the Indian Ocean. The more pressure that's put on the American position in the Persian Gulf, quite literally on the other side of the US mainland, the more the US would start to downscale their operations there as it just becomes too risky. It would take a while, but eventually the Persian Gulf trade is reopened. In the meanwhile, China still has formidable naval, industrial and missile assets. While it is lacking in oil for as long as Russia can't step up exports, with Japan, Taiwan, both Koreas, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines and China all united, China would have little issue securing the immediate Asian coastlines. Just with these developments, the rest of the world has already massively weakened the US position, as oil can now flow from the Middle East to China again, and while the Suez is still destroyed, Russian oil can now focus on Europe. By no means is the war easy for the coalition at this point, but trade to the two most important coalition regions, China and Europe, is now possible again, as even without the Suez trade routes, trade can follow the African coast or dock in the Middle East and be transported to and from the Mediterranean overland. Slowly but steadily, the coalition countries can start to focus their economies on war production as a new economic reality sets in. From this position, the world can slowly start to expand their breathing room and start to contest US naval hegemony elsewhere. Europe and China would be the main manufacturing centers of the world, as the rest of the world provides them with the necessary resources. It would be a long and slow build-up, but slowly but steadily, Europe and China can start to flex their international muscle, slowly pushing back US control over the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Progress would be slow, as the US military is still powerful, but the US still has many resources and military assets themselves, and while all this is happening, the US is also ramping up their own military production. But at the end of the day, just by looking at this map, it should be clear that the coalition has more people, more resources and faster production and will eventually overtake the US. More and more, the US has to abandon their outposts and restrict their defenses closer and closer to their homeland. From this position, the Europeans from the Atlantic and the Chinese from the Pacific can start to supply Latin America, finally preparing for the final conflict on the American continent. Slowly but steadily, the military capability of Latin America would improve. The strength of US attacks is reduced thanks to anti-air efforts, European and Chinese navies can slowly start to protect Latin American coastlines, and any American control away from the mainland would be abandoned, as America now fears that their assets there could get encircled as the American war efforts gets increasingly desperate. From here, slowly but surely, the tables are turned on the US. Progress would be slow, and by no means is an invasion of the US anywhere near close to happening, but the US is now slowly being strangled, while the world is increasingly safe to cooperate as they please. The US has lost the ability to influence anything outside of North America, and is increasingly starved for resources which aren't abundant in North America itself. The US retreats more and more as the coalition puts more and more pressure on the edges of US control. From here, the coalition, from Mexico and the Caribbean, can slowly start attacking positions on the US mainland itself, with especially resource deposits targeted, further weakening the US ability to compete with the rest of the world as oil fields, coastal cities, ports and infrastructure starts being destroyed. The US would continue to fight back vigilantly, and by no means is the US now on track for fast collapse, but the US, more and more, starts to run out of critical resources, having to revert back to obsolete technology. A full-scale invasion of the US is still far out of the question, considering that just the US population has 120 guns for every 100 Americans, but from here, it is a matter of time before the US loses. Assuming the world is actually motivated enough to see the war through, and somehow sees it as worth it to fully capitulate the US, the rest of the world would obviously manage to, and anyone who claims otherwise is wrong. It would take years, potentially even decades, for the global coalition to build up their logistics, war economies, industries, trading lines and more, but at the end of the day, the US cannot hope to compete with the rest of the world's resources and industries. And increasingly, the US would start to see their military advantage decline. The US is undeniably the most powerful nation on Earth, but with Europe, China, Russia, the Middle East and the rest of the world united against the US, it is undeniable that eventually the Americans would find themselves on the defensive. The Americans start the war at their most powerful, having a stranglehold over the world's oceans, but the work needed for the US to maintain this stranglehold cannot be upheld forever. The global coalition would start this war at their lowest, but the US cannot hope to push their advantage any further than this. Assuming the world is actually motivated enough to see this war against the Americans through and bear the struggles of their immediate difficult situation, the global coalition would eventually certainly win. But that's it for this video. Thank you all for watching, leave a like and a comment to help my video against the algorithm, and consider subscribing for at least one alternate history video every single week. A special thanks to these patrons who help me dedicate more time and effort to the channel by supporting me monetarily. To help the channel grow and get early access to videos whenever I complete them myself, consider supporting me there. Again, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.